Hey, thanks, Cole, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate Cole having this Zooming like a pro feature to kick things off to help us have the best possible opportunity to connect with one another today via these online platforms. So some reminders there about how you can rename yourself. It's often helpful to have your name along with your library so everybody knows where you're from. Some of the audio and video and chat features there. We've got some great staff, including Colette, that can help us keep tabs on the chat features. And then we'll have time a little bit later on for people to unmute yourselves and ask questions, and some time for more open discussion at the end of the website chat. So there'll be plenty of time for open discussion as well. I'm going to go ahead and jump into our agenda for today. Tracy is joining us. We wanted to continue to try to share the best possible information we have about communications with MMIA, the Montana Municipal Insurance Association, and some of the changes that they're implementing that impact city libraries. We have a meeting of the State Library Commission coming up in June, so I wanted to share with you some of the topics that are going to be on the agenda. Just a quick update on where we are in the continued implementation of the revised public library standards. Colette is going to visit with us about some early discussions that we're having about updating our continuing education program, updates to the public library survey, and then continued ways that you can connect with us through various information and news sources here at the State Library. So to kick things off, ask Tracy to give us an update and review of the information to date that we have to share with libraries about the insurance situation with MMIA.
So for those of you, whether you're city libraries or you're even a joint city county library, if your coverage, your insurance coverage, your building and property, or your board liability or workers' compensation is handled through your town or your city, this impacts you. And it's pretty complicated. And I've come to realize that just in the sheer number of questions that I've been trying to field and in the work with MMIA. And so what I thought I would do is just kind of run down through each of these and then talk through some different scenarios. Some key things to be aware of is that the first initial deadline of May 16th has passed, and that initial deadline was where your town or your city were supposed to indicate that they were either going to attempt to cover the library and go through some underwriting guidelines, or they were not. I have heard that MMIA has been granting extensions. So I hope that your town or your city has been communicating with you about whether or they have completed that paperwork. So that's probably your first question. If you don't know the answer to that, is what did your town say on that notice of intent to cover? Because that's going to give you a starting point. And so then we'll just kind of talk through the different coverages, because basically when this started out, MMIA was saying, we're not going to cover any of the things in the bulleted list, property, your building, your contents, liability insurance for the library board, workers' compensation for any employees and volunteers, and health insurance. As they started to work with us and kind of realize just how complicated this issue was, they sort of began to change how they were approaching it. And so I'm going to start with property and building. For most of you, the Montana Code actually says that your property, the library property or the building, is owned in the name of the city or county. And so while the law gives the library board the authority to manage what goes on in the building itself and its contents are technically owned by the local government entity. The only exception to this is independent library districts formed under Title 22. When MMIA kind of realized that, they said that they were willing to continue property and building coverage. They just needed the city or town to indicate that. They wanted that. And, you know, that isn't really their concern. This whole issue is being driven by risk management, and that risk comes in the form of the board liability and the workers' compensation. So you definitely should be having coverage for your property and building. Now, I know in some situations, the library is always paid for this insurance coverage, and you can continue with that. So moving down to the board liability and the workers' compensation, basically these were the big issues, and these were the things that drove MMIA to make this recommendation that was accepted by their board. And this coverage is, of course, if your board makes a decision in good faith, you know, that they thought was the right thing to do, and then they end up being involved in a lawsuit. And workers' compensation is somewhat similar. It comes into play if an employee is injured in some way. And if the employee can prove that they were injured due to negligence on the part of the board or the director or the library, then they could also file a lawsuit. And so that's why these two items were the biggest issue. And within that, it was most definitely the employee piece that was the biggest worry for MMIA, and is what led them to request that there be some sort of checks and balances. So these two pieces are the ones where if your library board does not want to cover these costs themselves, they will need to negotiate an agreement with the town or city. And I have seen a wide variety of agreements, but basically I would say they all have two themes. I'm seeing agreements where the city's basically kind of saying that the board can contract away, can sign a contract that gives away its authority over personnel, and therefore the library director is going to report to a mayor or city manager, and then the library staff will also be, they'll report to the director, but they'll basically be under the city manager. And you know, there are actually only really 2 or 3 libraries in the state of Montana where that might be okay. The rest of you, the attorney that guides the Montana State Library has kind of said, no, it would be unlawful for a library board to sign an agreement that gives away their authority over personnel. She believes it is mandatory language within the Montana Code that says the library board shall oversee the chief librarian and staff. And so I talked to other library directors who had great relations with their cities and towns, and from that came up with a draft agreement that MMIA was okay with, and that passed kind of the legal counsel review. And MMIA sent that to their members to let their members know that they were fine with this agreement, which the library board maintained its authority over hiring, evaluating, and terminating. The key difference is the library board is agreeing that you're going to basically follow the personnel policies, meaning you're basically following the hiring process. You know, library employees are being treated like other city employees in terms of benefits and so forth. And if you are evaluating or disciplining or terminating, you are going to basically follow the city's procedures, and you're going to definitely, in discipline or termination, let your city manager or mayor or your human resources department know that you are going through that process and take their advice. And if there's a disagreement, you know, for instance, if you, as maybe a library director, really think an employee needs to be terminated, but your city manager or mayor is like, no, they should remain, then the city and the library are agreeing to take the recommendations of either HR, if you have it, or a city or county attorney. And we recognize that that's not ideal, but one thing that MMIA pointed out to me is, you know, city officials, city attorneys, county attorneys, they're all supposed to take ethics training that says they will do what is in the best interest of the city or library. So they're supposed to be giving you good advice. And while we realize that there is a power structure there that it's important to be aware of in terms of the relationship of a city or city attorney to a city manager or mayor, they are ethically supposed to give you advice that will help you make the best decision going forward. And so that was the agreement that MMIA sent out to the towns and the cities. And if you as a library want to have board liability and workers' compensation coverage through MMIA, you will need to work with your town or your city to negotiate and finalize that agreement and sign off on it. And then there are some other things that you will need to do, generally involving training. Just to make sure that you are following good safety practices in the workplace, and then also that you are aware of some risk management things that as a board you may come across. So by far, that is the most complicated piece. The health insurance, we were able to find a place in the Montana Code that seemed to indicate that towns and cities and counties can include non-city employees in their health insurance pool solely for health insurance. And when we kind of brought up that piece to MMIA, MMIA was very clear that they understood that health insurance was expensive, that in fact it was better for their members to have as many employees in the pool as possible. And once they confirmed that it was okay with their stop loss coverage, which basically is what comes into play if someone has catastrophic health issues that causes them to have medical bills of more than $250,000. It goes to basically another insurance company, and that insurance company said they would cover library employees. So once they confirmed that that would happen, MMIA very clearly said, all the town or city needs to do is let us know that we will continue to include library employees in the health insurance employee benefits pool. There's no need to negotiate an agreement with the city or town for health insurance. There's no need to go through all those underwriting guidelines. You're basically just being included in the health insurance pool. And so I know that there is still confusion out there. I have talked to other city officials, mayors and clerks and city attorneys and tried to explain where we're at and what's going on. And I will say that MMIA has said if there is confusion or if you as library individuals are being told by your city, no, you have to sign away all the board's powers, to please encourage your city or town to contact MMIA, because they will communicate with the members about what they need and what the process is. So that's sort of where we are at now. And I kind of actually answered the second question of what the options are for you. Any questions? That was like a huge amount of information that I just dumped on you.
Any questions for Tracy? Question in the chat from Mitch. What do we make of MMIA putting forth another option to continue as before, but denying it to those cities who, before this option, made available to return a notice of intent marked yes? Email from Janelle Favero on May 9th.
So Mitch, if I'm understanding this right, is it basically that your city returned the notice of intent before MMIA had said you can just include health insurance, and now Janelle was telling the city of Livingston that they have to go through the underwriting process even to do just employee benefits? Am I understanding?
She said that to everybody, right? It said if your library staff has been participating in MMI employee benefits, blah, 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 you may allow to go on as before. then those cities and towns that return their notice of intent to pursue coverage will be required to meet the underwriting criteria. So that's like, well, we told our city that we wanted to pursue an option for coverage, so we had them answer yes. But if we'd have known that we could have done this other thing, we definitely would have gone with that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that if I'm understanding Alan right, that unfortunately an underwriting guideline went out that implied you had to do all the underwriting guidelines to do employee benefits, and they corrected it. And so I think in this particular situation, what Alan told me is that if the city just wants to do the employee benefits, they're supposed to let MMIA know. And so they would let MMIA know that that's all they need to do. That's all they're going to continue. The library is going to cover everything else. And then there's no need to negotiate an agreement.
And I think the notice of intent, it's not in any way legally binding.
Yeah.
So if you choose to just move forward with the employee benefits and look for options for board liability and workers' compensation, even if the notice of intent was already submitted, I think you can rescind that. I think that email on May 9th that you're referring to, Mitch, had an incorrect version of the underwriting guidelines, and the one that was resent yesterday, and Alan has said they're going to be resending it to all city officials today, has the corrected language regarding the employee benefits. What other questions? Do know that at this point, MMIA is being good about sharing their communications that are going to at least the broader group of members with us, so that we are sharing it with you when we see it. I can't speak specifically to one-on-one communication between MMIA and their city officials. We're not always privy to that information.
I don't think you are alone in that, Mitch. And I did have a question from another library director recently about the agreement, and she said that her city was treating the agreement where the library board retains their authority as like optional. And so unfortunately, you may have to like kind of communicate with your city or town. And I know this is not easy, and it is something I'm willing to help you with if you think it would make a difference, is that MMIA accepts that agreement where the library board retains its authority as long as you are following good HR management practices. And if you need me to say that to your city attorneys or whomever, I am happy to attempt to say it. I don't know if it will make a difference, but I definitely can do that for you. Please don't. I know it can be really intimidating sometimes when you're working with attorneys and other individuals. And so that's why we're having this session today, is to just communicate to you that you do not have to have your library board sign an agreement where they sign away all their powers. There are these alternatives.
Tracy, thank you. Other questions come to mind, folks, let us know.
You're welcome. Turn it back over to you, Jenny.
Thanks. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a preview of some of the topics that are going to be on the agenda for the June 15th commission meeting. That meeting will start at 9:30 and it will be available via Zoom. We are also beginning to hold our commission meetings in person, and it will likely be held in the Montana Capitol to give us ample room for social distancing as we continue to try to meet in a safe manner. But if you can't be in Helena, you're more than welcome to attend those meetings via Zoom. Some of the important topics that the commission is going to be looking at their upcoming meeting include nominations for our Network Advisory Council. Some of you will recall that about a year ago, we changed how we go about appointing members to the Network Advisory Council so that they actually go through a more formal nominating process with the State Library Commission, and then the commission formally accepts a slate of Network Advisory Council members. These new members will serve a 3-year term starting in July. So the commission will consider a slate of NAC members at their June 15th meeting. They're also going to consider some applications for new shared catalog libraries. Both the Billings Public Schools and the Harleton Public Library have applied to join the shared catalog this year. The commission will be considering recommendations from the Network Advisory Council and staff for a library development plan, as well as our Library Services and Technology Act 5-year plan. Every 5 years, we are required to go through a planning process and to submit that plan to the Institute for Museum and Library Services. That sets out the goals and objectives for how we're going to spend our Library Services and Technology Act funds and how our goals align with the priorities of IMLS. So we're currently drafting our LSTA 5-year plan. We've also started down a path of creating a library development plan, which is more of an annual plan that looks at our core service priorities as well as the goals for the Network Advisory Council on a more regular basis than just the LSTA 5-year plan. And our hope is in the future, our library development plan will also inform the development of that LSTA 5-year plan. These plans are something we've been discussing with the Network Advisory Council, and the Network Advisory Council is going to meet on June 8th to see sort of final versions of those plans before they go to the June Commission meeting. Also at the June Commission meeting will be a review of the FY23 Federation Plans of Service. Those are something the Commission always consider at their June meeting. We're going to be taking to the Commission a draft virtual programming policy. You've probably started to see more virtual programming coming from the State Library and informed by the Lifelong Learning for Services Committee. The goal behind the virtual programming is that it's a way to provide some shared capacity for providing access to online programming that libraries might not otherwise be able to provide. And part of the intent is to help libraries meet one of the new standards that will take effect on July 1, which is to provide some form of online access to programming, and providing that in a shared manner like that would meet the standards. Like we have with the Montana Library to Go collection development policy, which states that any challenges to content would be directed to the State Library Commission. We're recommending that this virtual programming policy also direct any challenges to any programming to the State Library Commission for due process and consideration. So again, we'll be taking a draft of that policy to the Commission in June, and then the Commission would be asked to formally adopt a policy at their August meeting. As I said earlier, we're going to be hearing from Collet about some plans to update our continuing education program. The Commission will receive a similar update at their June meeting. A couple of other sort of exciting, interesting things I wanted to be sure and draw to your attention. The commission is going to receive a presentation from some of our GIS staff about the work that the State Library is doing to support improved addressing data to both support next generation 911 services, which rely on a GIS or GPS location information to direct emergency response, and how that data can also support geo-enabled elections to better inform the districting and voter districting process. So that's something that more local governments will be involved in as they are working to improve local addressing information. So that might be something that is of interest to you as well. The commission is going to consider a draft freedom to read statement. This is something that we feel is important given the challenges to content in libraries across the country and in Montana specifically. The state library supports a patron base of librarians and state employees, and we think it's important for us to communicate to them the commission's views on the rights to access to information through our collections. And we hope that this statement will also be valuable as we work to consult with all of you on what is important in your own collection development policies. So we're going to take the draft Freedom to Read statement to the Network Advisory Council at their June 8th meeting. We'll take a draft statement to the commission meeting on June 15th. And then similarly, we'll ask the commission to formally adopt the Freedom to Read statement at the August meeting. Really welcome your input and involvement as the State Library Commission considers that statement. And then finally, a little bit of a sneak peek. The State Library Commission has been going through a rebranding process, and the staff have seen sort of an internal launch of a new logo for the State Library. And the commission is going to get a sneak peek of that logo at their June 15th meeting before we formally roll out the new brand right around the tri-conference at the 1st of August. So if you're curious about the new branding for the State Library, you can tune into the June commission meeting and get a sneak peek as well. So that's a pretty good overview of what the commission agenda will look like on June 15th. I think there'll probably be a few additional agenda items as well, but lots of important business for the State Library Commission to consider. We strive to get the agenda and those meeting materials posted 1 to 2 weeks ahead of the commission meeting. So look for those materials to be posted on the State Library website and a meeting announcement to go out via Wired and via our Gov delivery services a week or so ahead of that meeting. So in good Zoom practices, Clay reminds us that we should have a 1-minute break. So let's take a minute to stretch and reflect on anything that might be distracting us from our engagement with this meeting. All right. Ask if there are any questions or comments before we move on. Hearing none. Colleen, let's talk about CE program updates.
Great, thanks, Jenny. So there's a lot of information today, and so I just kind of wanted to give you a heads up and an overview. This information was also shared with the Network Advisory Council at their meeting earlier this month. But with, basically new standards that are coming into effect, there are a couple of things that need some definition and some thinking around, what does this mean in terms of our continuing education program? So we have this timeline for updating the program that includes many steps. So here we are in May. This plan has been presented to the NAC. We'll be discussing this with the commission in June. There will be a call for task force participants that happens in July and August. Our task force will meet over the course of the early and late fall into the winter, with a goal at this time to have draft recommendations for changes to the continuing education program available early in 2023. We want to make sure that there's plenty of time for both the task force to do its work, but also to seek input from staff members, trustees, and public library directors, each of whom who have slightly different requirements or non-requirements or different kind of ways that continuing education is defined. So we're really looking at just a little bit over a year from now, in August of 2023, having a new continuing education manual that's available and that we'll be using to do some awareness and training around any changes to the continuing education programs that come out of this process. So it's an ambitious, but I think doable schedule and timeline, and especially as we have those folks who are really experienced and have been part of the continuing education program, both for meeting requirements that are part of our standards, or in as staff members or directors, charting out those individual staff professional development plans that we're going to get a lot of good feedback from your experience over the last few years. So that's kind of the timeline in a nutshell. And as I said, we have these changes in the administrative rules of Montana, our library standards that go into effect on July 1. And I think this is something that was worth reiterating. This was part of a discussion that Jenny shared and that we shared with the Network Advisory Council as well. But really defining what it means for a board of trustees to receive at least 3 hours of continuing education. So Jenny, I don't know if you wanted to kind of reiterate what you had talked about there and just jump in.
Sure. Yeah. So as Clay said, one of the requirements in the new standards is that the board have 3 hours of continuing education. We've heard a lot of great suggestions and feedback about how the state library can coordinate what some of those training opportunities might look like, so that it can be easier for library boards to incorporate a small amount of CE regularly at your regularly standing meetings, etc. I think the important thing to keep in mind about this particular standard is that it does say the library board, which means at least a quorum of your library board is participating in that continuing education.
So look for more as we gather feedback. I think a really important distinguishing factor with this new standard is that the board, as Jenny says, a quorum of the board receives 3 hours of continuing education. And so that is different from certification. certification is still voluntary for trustees. So I think that was an important distinction to make. But in order to meet the public library standards, boards must receive that 3 hours of continuing education each year. And then you see the new rule number 3, which will have its official ARM 10.102. something when it gets published in the administrative register. But you'll see that that requirement for directors to be certified is maintained, and that there are really in terms of requirement, no significant changes here, but we really want to focus on how do we prepare and provide support for directors so that they have the tools and training they need, so that in turn is also available and really accessible to staff who want to improve their professional preparation and to increase their skills and knowledge as well-prepared professional library staff. So just something to think about when the rules are finally published. In July, we'll have more official versions of that to be able to share as well. So thank you for the question, Colleen and Kara, for chiming in. Yeah, I think that's that distinction that if trustees and some trustees do pursue and achieve certification, if they want to do that and continue to do that or renew, they do need to have that account in Aspen so that they can claim that continuing education for certification if they choose to go that path. So let's see here. And just one of the things that I thought was really interesting as I'm looking at the history of the continuing education program at the Montana State Library. And the initial certification program, kind of as we think of it in the modern era, was really established in 1990. And the categories, you'll kind of see some slight changes over the period of time from 1990 to 2009, when the last major revision to the continuing education program happened. And so that's just kind of a lingering question I want to pose to those of you who are here with us or watching this, looking at those continuing education categories. And we'll be checking in over the course of our work with the task force on, do these categories continue to make sense for us, or do we need to further define them? One of the key areas was around collection management and technical services and technology. So, it's one of those things that, thinking about the categories and how we are able to chart a path towards certification, do these CE categories continue to make sense? So that's just one thing to call to your attention. And then we have these general questions too, and these are more for you to think about and potentially as you would think about putting yourself forward or seeking a nomination to be part of that task force. Some of the big topic areas are recognition. As I looked at the history from 1990 and even further back in time to continuing education program, recognition is an idea that was part of the goals of continuing education. And it's taken different forms. So when we talk about recognition, achieving certification is certainly one type of recognition, but what other ways, in particular for staff for whom certification is voluntary, what does that meaningful recognition look like? Also, again, just to kind of reiterate this, what is it that trustees need, or even that directors need, in order to help trustees access continuing education that helps them know their role, know their responsibility, understand their authority, and just better prepare them to engage in the work of a board of trustees. And then, like I said, too, staff members, even thinking about categories and what is required or what flexibility might be available for staff members, really because their certification is on a voluntary basis, almost without exception, as a condition of employment, in fact. And then always we want to know, these are some questions that we put together and thinking about getting ready for the task force, but what other questions do we need to ask? And then what other information do we need? We have a lot of history. Tracy, myself, Jenny, many of the other state library staff have been part of the either the development of the changes in the continuing education program or have been a certified library person for many years. So you kind of get those blind spots sometimes when you've been swimming in it for a long time. So what are those other questions that we need to ask, and then what information do we need? So all of these are to kind of plant some seeds with you and to invite you, even before we start diving into creating a task force and sharing out information for feedback, that just invite you to think those thoughts and then get back to me with any ideas or suggestions that you'd like to. I'm going to put my email address here in the chat and just welcome you to send me your thoughts. And back to you, Jenny.
Thanks, Kalei. It's always fun to look to the future as we think about these programmatic evaluations and changes. It's really important for us to take time to do this reflection and think about the future of these kinds of programs and how they can be used to shape and furthering library development in Montana. So exciting to launch this effort. Just one more reminder, we talked about this at our last website chat, but we are implementing the new public library standards that take effect on July 1. So many of you have already submitted or are working on submitting your public library standard certification for this year, which is the last time you'll certify under the current library standards. The commission has granted a waiver for any of those standards that you might not meet, but that don't carry forward into the new set of standards. The new standards go into effect in July. We'll be issuing state aid checks in October. And then a year from now, when you're certifying that you meet the new public library standards, like the standard about your library boards participating in continuing education, you will certify that you meet those standards about a year from now. Then we have some information for you about this week's Directors Institute, which was organized by Kalei and Tracy and the great staff here at the State Library at the Erskine Center in Great Falls. So Kalei and Tracy, I'll let you share your impressions of the last several days.
Yeah, we're I think maybe between myself and Tracy and Kara and Pam and Suzanne, who staffed the Directors Institute, it was a great and exhausting week. It was a challenging week. And but the one thing that I just kind of wanted to share well, two things actually. One is a huge thank you to Joe Flick, who really put the groundwork together and really had everything planned for us going into actually coming together as a group. And so huge thanks to Joe. She was able to join us for a little bit on Tuesday for the second thing, which is we've had to keep this activity secret for a really long time, just because the whole theme and the whole kind of planning behind this institute was around collaboration. But kind of the subtext to that was being able to work together to solve problems, to provide solutions for each other, to provide support for each other. And that's really what this main exercise was about. And so the teams were, they were given each a box with a bicycle unassembled in it. And the teams really did some amazing work to be creative at problem solving and kind of figuring things out. But the ultimate, I guess, payoff in so many ways was that these bikes are being donated to the children that are served by the Ursuline Center. And so, you know, we went through these exercises, but also were able to really benefit the community that supported and hosted us for that week. So Tracy, I don't know if you want to add to that, but we had a really great time, and we'll look forward to planning another institute in 2024.
Yeah, I think the Ursuline Center, the director was so grateful, which was wonderful to just kind of have that enthusiasm at the donation of the bikes. And your peers worked really hard. There was some very deep thinking going on, and one of the groups that I worked with, I'm looking forward to sharing what they came up with, because I think they chose to tackle some of the real challenges that I've heard many librarians across the state talk about, which is kind of having better relations with local government and advocating for your staff and yourselves. So I kind of really commend that group for having the courage to kind of look at those issues and try to come up with some ideas for how to tackle them. There was some very deep thinking that went on, and a lot of fun too.
Any other takeaways? I know we have staff and others on the call who participated in the Institute. Just a reminder about how you can continue to stay up to date with work at the State Library. Of course, our website is always available for you. I hope you're signed up for a number of our different newsletters through GovDelivery. You can sign up for those newsletters from the State Library website. We have our help desk that we man. All of our communications go out via the wired listservs. Look for our Aspen events calendar for upcoming trainings, meetings, and other opportunities to engage with State Library staff. And of course, you're always welcome to email or call any of us. We're always here for you. So appreciate your time today. Just want to take a moment and ask if there are any further questions or comments, discussion about any of the topics we talked about today. Any questions that came to mind about the MMIA insurance issues or the upcoming commission meeting? Any questions for Colette or further reflections on the Directors Institute, or anything else that maybe we didn't bring up today that is on your mind? Great. Go ahead and stop the recording, and we'll hang out for just a few more minutes. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you guys for the MMIA